bet decision, when we have alternatives to choose, when we have resource to allocate, how do we go about making those decisions? And in addition to that, we'll be also moving the emphasis slightly towards a non-quantitative data. So it's non-numeric type data, which is types of decisions that a lot of you would be facing given the positions you're at, where you can't quantify things. How do you make decisions then if you can't quantify it? It comes under the broad area of wicked problems, dealing with that. How do we make decisions in situations like that? Okay, so the focus is on that. This session, operating in complex, shifting environment, dynamic environment, and we're looking at prescriptive and experimental. We're looking at not only making decisions, but we're going to focus on making quality decisions. Okay, not just making a decision, and we're looking at the different scenarios that we face when we have to make decisions, from very structured type situations to very unstructured or flexible or wicked type, complex type problems that we have to deal with. And in terms of the extreme where we're dealing with wicked problems or non-quantifiable problems, what we're focusing on this course, how do we get the best? And we'll be calling on a nice philosopher which I tend to look up to, and that's Habermas, and he talks about the ideal speech situation. How do we go about making decisions within the group to ensure that we get the best potential discourse going and the best information that we need for our decision. We want to look at the dimensions that relate to a quality decisions. As I mentioned, look at the different scenarios. One of the things, as I mentioned, I think in week 1, when we spoke about decision making, we said that in general, the trick is, and I'll be really happy at the end of 3 weeks' time, you go away with the idea that, you know, it's not one size fits all. Different scenarios, different situations will require a different approach, different type of model, and dealing with that sort of issue is coming into play. And we look at the different tools and techniques that apply to the different sorts of scenarios. We're facing a dynamic, changing environment, and this picture, I think, relates to things that could happen to us if we don't think hard enough. If you look at that, we think, oh yes, that's a familiar situation. It looks very familiar to us. And when we look a little bit closer, we realize that it's not what we initially thought it was. Okay? And in a lot of decision scenarios that we face, that sort of issue is there. We have to look twice to find out what it really represents and how we can then tackle it. The other thing that the lesson that we're going to master or learn is that hindsight does not give rise to good foresight. Because the environment is changing a lot, when we look at what has happened in the past and make decisions based on our experience, and then try to extrapolate it into the future, tend not to work because the environment that we're within is changing drastically. So information that we use from the past tend to make us feel what we're really doing is cycling backwards. We're going backwards rather than looking forward. And we'll talk about one of the things, the issues is, you know, should we use intuition? Intuition is basically all my thoughts and ideas in the past that I bring to the fore. And the answer to that is, don't just discount intuition. Intuition should always be just the starting position. Then we have to qualify, get information, because, as I said, intuition is based on historical experiences that doesn't necessarily apply to future situations. So we don't want to cycle backwards. Now, one way organizations can achieve excellence, and this is just slightly moving away from the key topic that we're providing, and that is our leadership. Okay, the best way to achieve excellence is to have leadership that focuses on the cognitive type issues, and this is what you're doing in this unit. How do we make decisions? How do we take information, qualitative, quantitative, and massage it in such a way, cognitively, that we can then infer what might happen and make corresponding decisions. In the literature, under the heading of complexity leadership, they talk about 2 types. It's a slightly different paradigm in terms of leadership. Not, you know, you should do this, you should motivate. That's all great. But basically what the complexity theory, or complexity leadership theory, is arguing there's two dimensions. In fact, they talk about three, but two dimensions that come into play. One is strategic managerial leadership, and the other one is what they call adaptive leadership. Okay, and basically we have strategic managerial leadership, and here the focus is on setting up systems. It's a command and control mentality. You know, to make a buck, the organization has to have good systems in place, make good decisions, have information that they require, and all important aspects. Okay, the other extreme that they argue is the adaptive leadership, being aware of what's happening in the environment. So I can have the best systems in the world, but if I'm not aware of what's happening in the environment and the change that's occurring, we tend to fall short in general. When we look at this, there's a disconnect between that and that. Here we're looking for control and command and control dimension, whereas here it's change and movement that we're looking at in terms of the environment. A good example of these two extremes of disconnect is the one that I like to use is the army situation, where traditionally in the army they were fantastic there. They had good systems, good processes, they could fight wars very well, they could organize huge amounts of people and cater for that sort of thing very well in terms of that strategic managerial. Over the years, and what's happening now is that, even though it's important, is not the clue to success. What should happen now, and is happening, is now we're catering for the changed environment. So rather than fight wars, we deal with or involve ourselves with the community needs, different groups within their different cultures, working with those sorts of people, because that whole situation or the whole idea represents that change that's occurring. And now there's a good balance between how they tackle a conflict. Hilda, my wife, for many years with a partner, owned and ran a quilt. She quilts, and they ran a fabric shop many years. And I remember, she's no longer with it, she's retired now, but remember her once complaining the fact that all these online people are interfering with her business and having an impact, because they used to sell fabrics, what they call half quarters or fat quarters and those sorts of things, and well displayed. They had systems, they had training, all very well organized, but they were not aware of what was happening there, didn't have the skills to tackle for the changing competition out there in terms of, and my response to her was, you know, no point complaining, this is what's happening, you better start doing something to cater for that. And they did. They moved towards, they got into bid with a supplier of fabric, and they used that as a basis to do things that now put them not only doing well there, but able to compete with the changing environment, like, as I said, the internet purchases and all, which sold things much cheaper than what they could, in fact. Now, what we'll be focusing on is how do we make good decisions, or that cognitive aspect that I mentioned earlier, in both this step, which is important, and also dealing with ongoing response to change. Here is more the qualitative aspect. The literature on leadership, complexity leadership, talks about adaptive leadership. So they have strategic, they have the adaptive, and the balancing, what they call enabling leadership is the third dimension, where it's saying, you know, so organizations can just focus too much on that and go down the gurgler. Some can focus too much on marketing type people, tend to focus too much on that and not worry about their own systems and processes. And so that enabling leadership is one that tries to find that balance between the two. So we're thinking and deciding in terms of the cognitive dimensions of leadership. And again, the focus is on the quality of the decision that's made. Just also in passing, we talk in terms of a disequilibrium model of decision making. And basically, what we're saying is here more of the equilibrium, here more towards the side disequilibrium, where there's no stability, and the degree is in terms of the y-axis. And the idea behind it is What we want to try to determine is the edge of what we refer to edge of chaos, and this is coming from the complexity science. And basically we want what is referred to as the productive zone. As an example, when we have equilibrium, if we have a pot of water on the stove or on the range and there's no fire, it's still nothing happens, or it's just there. If we put the heat too much or too high, it starts bubbling and just chaotic. It becomes very hard to follow and deal with. Whereas what we have to try to do is move toward there where we have the water just simmering, just enough heat. A good example that's occurred to me, happened to me, and one of the reasons that contributed to my early retirement was the fact that at Curtin, at that stage, the graduate school, and I understand it's happening here or just happened here, is that the university tended to change its focus. Curtin was becoming more commercial. We had to be profitable. We were concerned about student numbers and costs and those sorts of things. And it stifled the reason why I became an academic was because I wanted that freedom. And what they were saying, no, you have to print or you have to publish in A journals. I was publishing in the B and C journals, which had more practical application in industry, not the academic, which really, I always argued, it was academics massaging each other's back. Scratching, you scratch my back and I'll scratch your back, and so it was a good feel, but was from a usefulness, it tended not to apply. So what happened then is there was a lot of frustration. Our head of school realized that most of us, especially me, at my age, very comfortable in terms of what I was doing, just doing areas, researching areas that I liked, didn't worry too much about, as long as I got certain number of publications a year, I was doing well, happy, not very creative, but happy. Okay. There. And once the system changed, we were in that state. They wanted this, we had to preach in A journals and all that stuff, which was really chaotic. And what our head of school did was to help us and move us towards that, what they call line of indifference or edge of chaos, which is the productive zone. And she provided us with support, additional staff support, people that could actually help us with our publications, getting records done, and so on. So there was a lot of help that reduced our load and moved us closer towards that. And while that was being done, I noticed myself, I was thinking, oh yes, now I still have to do that. And I started becoming a bit creative. Maybe I'll do it differently, I'll do it this way. So that creative juices started to surface, which hadn't done for many years, because I was very comfortable with what and that situation prevailed. So the idea behind it in complexity theory is to saying, let's move towards that particular zone, because that's where the change occurs in organization. So organization that takes the stance, and apparently some of you would have heard of it. There's a chap that I have a lot of respect for, and that's Dave Snowden, who has the Kinnaman model that he talks about. And his idea is organizations and managers and decision makers who tend to try to get stability within the organization, equilibrium, tend to not succeed in the long term, because the flexibility that they require isn't there, the creativity isn't there. They put systems into place, try to get things as smooth as possible, and with that it stifles the flexibility, and we'll talk about it when we deal with his concept. So we want a disequilibrium, but not too much where things are happening where everyone gets just frustrated because no one knows what's happening. And it's the movement between that we need to focus on. Now, having said that, one question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is a good decision? Okay, there are three dimensions that people tend to talk about, and there's a whole series of different variations of the same word, but these three capture what we tend to want to consider when we talk about a good decision. And these come, Cappuccina is the one that actually talks about these, and it's not rocket science, it's things that most of us do anyway when we have to make decisions. And basically one, we have to look at the process that we're using. And we've been dealing with processes and tools and techniques that we can actually deal with that are sound. And even though sometimes the decision is a wrong one because of circumstances, if we have a sound process that we use, people can't come back to you and say, hey, you did the wrong thing or you made the wrong choice. So that's what we want. It's the process, the quality of the content, the information that we use. I think a common term that you hear battered around is garbage in, garbage out. So if you have information that's not really appropriate or not good, it tends to impact on the quality of your decision. So that's the content. And finally is the matching of your aims, and it has to be aligned with the organization requirements. So internal alignment with the vision that the organization has. So these three things are the things that we tend to have to look for when we decide whether we've made a decision that's of quality or not. Main focus, as I mentioned, is on the process, because the process is something that is independent of the chance. So sometimes, you make a very good decision, you think the choice that you made was fantastic, it was a good choice that gave profits, but that was just due to chance. In the same note, the next day, the interest rate changes or reduces, the good decision becomes a bad decision. So you were subject to the chances that were occurring. And given that, it's hard to judge whether the decision is good or not, because you were faced with the factors that were impacting on the results or the outcome, I should say. So if that's the case, if those dimensions make up a good decision, what are the things that we should be focusing on if we want to make a good quality decision? Many years ago, when I was at Curtin, they had a section, so it's not directly involved with the school, but a section called the CDIQ, Center for Innovation and Decision Quality, that I directed, and there we developed different tools and techniques and software for decision making. And one of the things that we came up with, again, not rocket science, was available generally, but we use our term, and that is 3 dimensions. One is sense making, the next is architecture, and team capital. So when we talk about sense making, it's gathering intelligent information to make sense of the situation that we face, to understand what we're faced with. Because once we do that, we can then move to the next phase where we talk about the architecture, the building. Which tools do we use, which process do we use, how do we combine it to make our best decision. So that's the architecture side of it. And to ensure we make good decisions there and there, we talk about the team capital. That is, maximizing the reach of the human potential that we're dealing with, the people that we're dealing with, make sure they give the best towards the decision that we have to make. So those 3 combine, as I said, and they're interrelated. They're not this, that, they're all intertwined. Sometimes we do that and go back to there and so on, but it's the 3 dimensions. Now let's first of all focus on the first one, sense making. When we talk about sense making, is, as the name implies, try to understand the situation that we're faced with. Because with that, we can then proceed to decide what to do about it, once we understand. Now, when we talk about sense making, we say that we have to use, not only get different data, but we have to integrate or use or map the data together, especially now with big data that we're dealing with. As an example, say if I'm driving a car down the road, I've got a vision, I need to go to that particular place, and as I'm driving I see a little child playing by the side of the road. Now that's a bit of information that's there, and I make decisions in terms of adjusting my speed and what have you based on that information. So it's good information that's there that I can use. Now as I'm driving along and making it, I also see a little puppy, white fluffy little puppy on the other side of the road. Now that's another bit of information that I have. And again, I can make decisions appropriately. Where the strength of the decision comes into play, and that's where, when Thursday or in 2 weeks' time when Paul talks to you, we talk about integrating that data, how we map, and the hypotheses that we come up with. Oh, I assume that, there's a good chance that the child will run across the road to pet the little puppy. Can you see? So when we talk about databases, we're pulling data from all different places, and when we talk about data analytics and how we use it, is how do we match the data that's coming from different sources to give us that extra bit of information or insight that we would normally not have. Does that make sense? That's the integration bit that we talk about. Now, in terms of that, we also have frames, how we look at the situation coming to play. And I like to think about frames from two different perspectives. One is the framing effect, and the other one is decision frames. Okay? But before that, when you talk about frames, a nice way to think about it is, say if I'm in a room and there's picture windows, big glass panels there, big glass panel here, big glass panel there. Now if I stand close to this particular panel, that frame, all I see is the paddock in front of me and the number of sheep or whatever in front of me, so I can use that information. If I look through this, I get a different set of information that I can use to advantage. And looking through this particular room, I also get a different set of information. Okay, decision framing is basically saying, yes, because we all have our own partial reality of that situation, that's a partial view, What we should do to enhance the decision quality is to make sure that we have representation of the different views. Traditionally, we used to say, oh, we have to have the marketing man, the production person, the finance person at the meeting so that we can get a different perspective. Now it goes further than that. We talk about gender differences, religious, cultural differences that we have to bring to get the rich picture, make sense of the situation using a richer picture. In research that we do, and as I mentioned to you all several times, I think I supervise qualitative research in addition to quantitative, and there's a concept of reality, the ontology of reality is that there's one set called the positivists that say, oh, there's one reality out there in the world, right? And what we have to do in terms of the epistemology, the knowledge that we get from there, is to try to see what are the different factors that impact on the thing that we're interested in. Typical of what you're doing in your assignment. Motivation is there, is that reality there. And if I know this, this, and this, and this, I can predict that particular reality, what level of motivation there is. Okay, that's a positivist perspective. And that's also fine. So your work that you're doing is, to a large extent, a positivist study. Your assignment that you're doing now. The other extreme is what we call a constructivist. And the ontology there is there's multiple realities. The first one, positivist, is there's one reality out there that we have to apprehend, find out, measure. Whereas the other extreme is saying, hey, there's multiple realities. There might be a quasi-reality out there, but I see it quite differently from you. It's different colored glasses that we're looking at the same situation and interpreting it differently. So that multiple reality is people coming from different perspectives, and what we have to do is try to understand, are there any common themes that emerge from that? So that's what we call qualitative research. The positivist is quantitative research. So those are the two extremes. And the idea behind frames, decision frame, is to ensure that we get the balance. And also the ontology that we have. What is it that we believe? What is it that we're trying to achieve in terms of what we do? And we'll talk about some of the tools. The framing effect, on the other hand, is it's the risk tolerance. There's a lot of studies that's done, and if you're interested, I brought something from my shelf. There's a book called Judgment in Managerial Decision Making by Bazerman, and he talks about the different risk attitudes. So the idea behind it, and not to go into too much detail, the idea behind it is basically that depending on how you frame the question or how you ask questions, for argument's sake, the response will be different. So if I couch my question in the negative sense, the choices that will be made will be different from if I couch the question in a positive sense. And the examples that they cite here, if I say, oh, if we do this initiative, 40 people will die. So do you want to choose this or not? The choice that they make, according to the studies that have been done, would be different if you went and said, hey, if you do this, 60 people will live. The same thing, but how we actually word the question, a negative or positive, will determine. So we have to be very careful how we ask or how we deal with the types of questions that's there. So there's a lot written in the psych area in terms of how people are influenced by the way the questions are asked or worded. So that. And again, as I mentioned, just to reinforce with a couple of slides, in terms of reality, because the term that we use when we do research and qualitative stuff is partial reality. Most people think that the reality that they say is the reality, when in fact it's just a partial reality that they're dealing with. Okay, so getting different perspectives give us a better feel as to what the whole is. And here's a good one. Perspective. This person is saying, hey, there's 4. And that person says, no, there's 3. Which one's right, which one's wrong? Okay, it's just a different perspective of that situation. The one I like is this. Dad throwing up the kid. This is how the father sees it. Throws up the kid. The child thinks, wow, I'm really high. The mother panics and thinks that that's the situation in terms of throwing up the. I think that's a good one to see the perception and the perspective that individuals have. Now, nice one. Rogers talks about integrative thinking, and one of the things that also, as decision makers, when we're trying to make sense of the situation, that we should be aware of, at least be conscious of it, and that's integrative thinking. Now, different perspectives, frames. So in this case, it's narrow and deep. That's my way of looking at things. Okay, I see an issue there, I probe and I really delve into it. So it's a narrow focus, but deep. Go into it. Some other people tend to have a style that's a little bit different, preference that's different, and there's wide and shallow. They look at all the different aspects of the decision and looks at everything that's possible, but don't go into any great depth into the situation. I work in consulting that I do. I've got a couple of colleagues I work with, and they know that that's what I won't even mention something if we haven't thoroughly researched it, not going in with that particular view. Now, complexity theory says it's not a case of either or, either that or that. The whole concept is and. It's not or but and. We can do this and that. So to get a good idea of the situation in terms of that integrative thinking that Rogers tends to talk about is basically looking at the whole picture. And I like this. I'm not a good programmer, but I just love this. By taking that view, you can see storms coming in or potential competition impacting on you, because if you didn't have that view, you couldn't cater for that. So that gives you that awareness of potential or possibility when you have to make choices and decisions that you're faced with. So it's in complexity science, it says it's the and rather than the or. Not this or that, but that. And I'm trying to get better at having a broader and shallower perspective there and not losing out on the deep. A chap, I understand that have you done economics? It's covered? No, management. Project management. There's a chap called Dave Snowden, and he developed, it's Cognitive Edge is his organization. I was trained by him many years ago, and what he has is a model called Kniffen, the Kniffen model, and there's a video that I'll be showing you in a second. And basically it says to understand the situation, and this is part of a sense-making process, is to look at the situation from 4 quadrants from a cause-effect type perspective. So if you look at a cause-effect perspective, we can have 4 potential quadrants he talks about. And these include the simple, or sometimes we call obvious, I think, which is fine. Situations where we're faced where the relationship between the variables are fairly that we've done it before. We know that in terms of the quadrant, this, if we do this, we'll get that. So it's fairly known, fairly simple, fairly obvious, the solution, and we're looking for best practice. And in that case, if we're faced with situations where the cause and effect is known, if we spend 5% more the impact will be on our profits by being reduced by whatever the amount. Okay, so the cause-effect relationship is fairly clear. And here, all we need to do in that decision situation, as we'll go through some models, we sense, oh, there's a problem, profits are going down or whatever. We categorize, oh yes, in terms, and usually we use 4-quadrant. I brought a book if you want to refer to. This whole book, The Power of the 2x2 Matrix, of all the different possible combinations, SWOT analysis and all that, and how we, if we know this, we can get that. So it's fairly straightforward in terms of how we apply it. And so we sense it, we categorize it, whether it's a 2x2 matrix or a little bit more complicated, and then we respond accordingly. Yes, this is what we should be doing. Okay, so that's his known situation. You can face, he argues, a situation where there still is that cause-effect relationship, but it's not that absolutely clear. Okay, it's complicated, he calls it. So simple, complicated. What we're faced with there is that complicated situation. We sense, oh yes, there is a problem. We analyze it, solve it, analyze it, and then we respond. I tend to fall in that particular category because you try different techniques there. You know, you get some expert coming in or someone that's in the organization that knows it. You might do a regression analysis to solve it, or you might use a factor analysis or discriminant analysis. You do different analyses to come up with a solution. So it's complicated. We have to be careful here because when we talk about cause and effect, it's not very clear. What we're trying to do is to ensure that we come up with a solution that's analyzed well so that we can respond accordingly. So it's complicated in that sense. Okay, so simple, complicated. Sometimes we also face, using this quadrant, situation where cause and effect is there, but it's intertwined, there's overlap. So there's overlap, he calls that complex. So contrary to some belief that, you know, when we have a complex situation, we don't know what the cause effect is. It's there, but it's not that obvious. Okay, so here we have what is called complex, and to solve that situation, we probe, we sense, and respond. Here, as I said, the simple categorization. Here, even though we don't know what the solution is, we can analyze it. He talks about knowable. So even though I might not be able to build a Rolls Royce, but there are people who can. Okay, it's knowable in the sense that it can be solved. There are experts around. So that's the domain of experts, if you wish. That. Here, in terms of probing, emergence, so what we don't know what's going to happen. The interrelationship. So if I have, let me just show this. If I have in this situation 4 agents, 4 dots, 4 departments, 4 people, doesn't matter what. So these are agents. Okay, I'm saying that if I have 4 agents, n equals 4, the number of possible links, I can link that with that, that with that, that with that, and so on. I can come up with 6 possible links. The number of possible patterns, that's a pattern, that's a pattern, that's a pattern, all possible combinations, I can come up with 64 patterns within that. Okay, now, if I said, what if I had 10 dots, 10 agents, 10 departments, and I'm trying to implement some policy or whatever, and I want to try to get some understanding of what that situation is. How many potential patterns do you think we'll have if we have 10 agents? 200, 500? 1,000? Any other suggestions? If I had 10 dots, the number of patterns that will occur is 3.5 trillion. So it's almost impossible to do that. So we probe, we send, and report. It's normally in hindsight. I remember when we had the fires, the Good Friday fires in Sydney, and the talking heads on TV. Oh, we should have done this. We should have had burnings. We should have. So everyone knows what the answer is in hindsight. But before that, because of all the possible combinations, it's fairly difficult. And in fact, in practice, a lot of times you see that, let's say if I have agents departments that I'm working with, and I have an initiative that I want to try out. And I try out this initiative between different sections, and what happens is the impact of that is very small. Nothing happens. I've done all these initiatives, nothing really has happened in the organization. On the other hand, with this sort of idea, the complex, I can have agents all around, and I just do a little bit of work there or some initiative there, and what happens is, whoop, it impacts on a whole lot of things within the organization. And I didn't think it was going to, and it happened. So normally it's in hindsight, and hence we probe, suck it and see. We try this, it's working, that's good. Or if it's not working, we take away the resources, as he would argue. So we don't know what the situation is there, but we know there's some sort of a relationship, but it's almost impossible because of the number of possible things or combinations that can happen for us to actually plan as we would there and the other one. And finally, chaotic. Here, we act, we sense, respond. The September 11 atrocity occurred. I remember, what's his name? What was the mayor's name? Giuliani. He was here, in fact, with a few others. They were doing a presentation, and someone asked, how did you know what to do? And he said, I didn't. It was chaotic. I acted. I brought the fire section there. If it worked, I continued. If it didn't work, I disbanded and did something else. So he acted, sensed what the outcome was, and then responded accordingly. So the decision-making style and what they do there is quite different to what you would do here, quite different from what you would do there and there. And this schema, if you wish, that Snowden come up with is a good way to classify this type of decision and the tools and techniques that we can use for. What Giuliani was doing was, in fact, he was moving his situation up towards the pro, suck it and see. So he was really trying to make a chaotic situation into a complex. Sometimes textbook, and I think in the video that I'm going to show you, he mentions it. He talks about in the stable condition. Here, what we have is fail-safe. So if you know the system, you put systems into place, that it's fail-safe. You can, if something happens very quickly, you can respond. Okay. Here, he talks about, and I like the term he uses, he calls it safe fail. So what you want to do is create an environment that's safe fail, safe to fail. Because you're probing, you're trying, you don't know what the outcome is, you don't punish someone because they've done something or tried something and it didn't work. Okay, you give them that particular authority or flexibility to actually work with that. So the safe fail idea, I think, is a good one when you deal with a complex type situation. Most of us in practice would tend to work in that particular zone. He talks about if we have too many systems in place, you have systems and processes in place, there's a tendency that you could fall into the chaotic zone. And that's a big danger. You don't want to accidentally fall into this because it'll take huge costs involved. Sometimes you want to try to move people into that intentionally. That's fine, and the strategies to do that. What happens there is when we spoke about, the age of chaos, because what happens then, there's creativity that you're creating, pushing them to actually deal with that situation, that uncertain situation, not too much, but that uncertain situation where you get the creative. So the strategy all based on just these 4 quadrants, if you wish. So we'll go through that a little bit, and any questions or comments? Does that make sense in terms of that 4-quadrant idea, cause-effect relationship? I think it's a good one other than all the other aspects. It's a good one that locates. When I did work with an organization, they had a big problem that they had to solve, and what we did was the first step was to use this particular framework, and they very quickly realized that that decision, that problem, was not just one decision. To increase the international profile, they had to do this, they had to do that, they had to do many different things for that. So it's not just one decision, but a whole, and some more decisions were simple, so others were more difficult, and so on. Mainly these 3 quadrants, not that these requirements. So what you do by using this particular method is to locate the type of area that particular aspect of your problem, or if it's a simpler one, it's just one or two, and basically saying, okay, what are the tools that are appropriate there? Like, what are the tools that are appropriate here to come up with the whole? There's some, for some reason, and this was in Kuala Lumpur, this organization, a banking organization, that tended to think, oh yeah, it's a decision, one decision you have to make, and very quickly realize it's not. There are components of decisions that have to be considered. Okay, what I want to do now is put on Dave's. There's a whole series. I'm just going through one, the Cynefin model. I'll show you one, but there's about 15 to 20 different ones, and I urge you, if you find it interesting, to get hold of it, because I know I use it a lot, and it's becoming more and more and more important, and as it's being.
This is the Cynefin framework, pronounced Cynefin, for those of you who don't speak Welsh. The origin of the name itself is deserving of explanation. Its literal translation is habitat or place, but what it actually means is the place of your multiple belongings. It's this very sense that you're rooted in many different paths which profoundly influence what you are, but of which you can only ever be partially aware. And the reason it's a good name for a complexity model is that's a complex system. You have thousands of modulators influencing the development of the system. They influence what you are, but you can never fully know what they are. A couple of key points to make about the model. First of all, it's a sense-making model, not a categorization model. And the difference there is key. A categorization model is a classic 2x2 matrix that you see in consultancy handbooks. And in those models, the framework precedes the data. As a result of which, it's very fast because we can just drop the data into the appropriate box and decide accordingly. The danger is that actually we won't see subtle differences until they're too late, so we'll be caught out. Right? So categorization is good for exploitation. It's pretty poor for exploration or during periods of change. A sense-making framework, on the other hand, the data precedes the framework. The patterns or the framework itself emerges from the data in a social process. Now, for the purpose of this brief explanation, I'm going to treat it as a set of categories, but that's an important distinction. Categorization models, framework precedes data. Sense-making models, data precedes framework. And of course, one can become the other, and we'll need resetting from time to time. We take the three basic systems here: ordered systems, complex systems, chaotic systems. We create a new category called disorder, and we divide order into two, simple and complicated. In the simple domain, this is an ordered system. That means the relationship between cause and effect exists, is predictable, it can be determined in advance. In simple order, that relationship is self-evident to any reasonable person, as a result of which the decision model is sense, categorize, respond. We see what's coming in, we make it fit previously determined categories, we decide what to do. The model here is that we apply best practice, a phrase which is legitimate in this domain, but illegitimate in other domains. In the complicated domain, there is a relationship between cause and effect, there is a right answer, but it's not self-evident. So I either have to deploy an analytical method, hence sense, analyze, respond, or call in experts who've built expertise within that domain who can make the right decision. Accordingly, I don't apply best practice, I apply good practice. Now, a distinction between good and best practice is actually quite important. In a complicated domain, there are several different ways of doing things, all of which legitimate if you have the right expertise. And trying to force people to adopt one of them is actually quite dangerous. it will basically piss people off, to be honest, to the point where they won't apply best practice where it should be applied. Right? So simple and complicated we're familiar with. Sense categorize, respond. Sense analyze, respond. Best practice or good practice. Complexity, on the other hand, is a system without causality. It's a system of like constraints on agents. Agents modify the system. So our decision model here is probe, sense, respond. We conduct safe-fail experiments. We don't do fail-safe design. If an experiment succeeds, we amplify it. If an experiment starts to fail, we dampen it. In fact, we shouldn't even do an experiment unless we've identified our amplification and dampening strategies in advance. And of course, what happens here is we get emergent order, i.e. something which comes out of this is emergent practice, it's a new way of doing things, it's novel, it may be some combination, but it's different and it's unique. In a chaotic environment, if we enter it deliberately, it's for innovation, but if we enter it accidentally, then we need to stabilize the position quickly. So the decision model is act, sense, respond. We move very quickly to stabilize the situation. Any practice will be completely novel in terms of the way things work. Now you'll notice that that gives us a very easy way of deciding how to work, but it gives us a divergent. We sometimes call this requisite applicability. It basically says, dependent on which space you're in, you should think differently, you should analyze differently, rather than a one-size-fits-all, which has been a tradition of management theory. Now the central space disorder, and this is key, is the space of not knowing which of the domains you're in. And that's where we are most of the time. And the trouble then is we will interpret the situation according to our personal preference for action. Now the danger is if you spend 2 or 3 years of your life in a purely bureaucratic process-based role, then you tend to see all problems as a failure of process. If you're a deep expert, then any problem is a failure to give you enough time or resource to do analysis. Natural complexity workers, battlefield commanders, politicians, their reaction to a crisis is to get lots of different people together from lots of different backgrounds in a desperate hope that somebody will come up with the right solution. That's actually quite a good strategy. And of course, the fascists love a crisis because then they can be given absolute command of everybody who has to do what they're told. So what you get in a normal decision environment is that people are in a disordered space, assessing the situation according to their preference for action. One of the main functions of the Canavian framework is to allow people to say, hang on a minute, it's complex, therefore we probe, or hang on a minute, that's complicated, which expert shall we bring to bear? Another key aspect of the Canavian framework, which is frequently missed off by people who try and oversimplify it, is the boundary between simple and chaotic is different from the other boundaries. It's actually represented in the Harvard Business Review article as a cliff, or in other articles as a symbolic type of wave at the bottom. Yeah? The principle here is if you start to believe that things are simple, you start to believe that they're ordered, you start to believe in your own myths, you start to believe that past success means you're invulnerable to future failure, you effectively move to the complacent zone, which is the boundary between simple and chaotic, and you fall over the edge in a crisis. Right? All the other boundaries allow for transitions. For this, you fall over the edge and recovery is very, very expensive. It therefore follows that you should manage in the complicated and complex spaces and only move a very small amount of material down into the simple, because that's actually highly vulnerable to rapid or accelerated change. So the Canavian framework is a decision framework. It's an analytical framework. It's been used for decision theory, it's been used for knowledge management, it's been used for IT design, for project management, because it recognizes the causal differences that exist between different types of system and gives people a very quick and easy way to flip between them so they can use the appropriate method for the appropriate domain.
after the movie. Okay, so that's this side of the continuum that we're talking about. Now, most times we are faced with a bit of a messy type scenario, closer to the right-hand side of that continuum rather than the left-hand side. And with wicked or messy problems, again, there's certain characteristics of that, and basically there's no answer, no one right answer. We don't know whether we've got an optimum situation. All that we can say is, oh, by doing that is better than where we were previously. So these are sorts of things. There's no end point. When do we stop? Because with wicked problem, when we stop there, we get an answer. It creates another problem. It creates something else. So it's very hard to deal with. And most of you would be faced with that sort of decision scenario. So there's a whole series. There are 10 really, but these are the 6 more important ones. So in that case, if we look at what we had earlier, when we have a decision to make, there's divergent thinking. And in that divergent thinking of all the things and all the, sense that we can make from the data, it gives rise to chaos and fragmentation. And this chaos and fragmentation that occurs when we're trying to understand the situation comes from 3-4 different dimensions. One, the pace of change, the fast and the change. We do that, and the situation has changed. We have to then revert to something else. So it's constantly changing. It makes it really chaotic. So technical complexities, technology that's coming, new technology, how does that impact on what we're doing? Can we improve what we're doing? A lot of that tends to contribute to the chaos and fragmentation. The problem wickedness, another one. And the most important one, I think, in terms of how it impacts on the decisions that we make is what we call social complexity. The UAC complexity is sometimes referred to, and I think one of the papers that I'll be referring to next week is in terms of the UAC complexity, and that's uncertainty. We're not sure what the situation is. The ambiguity, what does that mean? How do we interpret? People have different realities that interpretation can be a problem. And finally, the other thing that contributes to this chaotic situation is contradiction. Oh, I think we should be doing this. Oh, I think we should be doing that. Someone else thinks we should be doing it. So there's always contradiction that's there. And that social interacting causes a lot of problems and implications. Okay, one of the readings that you have expands a little bit on that, and that's the one that was given to you. How many of you read that? Good. So that gives you a little bit of that insight. So when that happens and when that's occurring in a wicked type problem, what we have is we can't actually converge. All that's happening is there's no convergence that we have. The chaotic phase is causing that we can't come up with a solution because things are changing and happening as we go along. So in that case then, what do we do? We tend to take 2 possible strategies. One is what we call naive simplicity, and the other one is overwhelming complexity that we tend to cater for or deal with. Let's go through each one and see what so the first one is naive simplicity, is that premature convergence. So what we have here is, to simplify it, why can't they just lock them up and throw the key away to that problem? Why can't we just send them back to where they came from with the people type issue? Or why don't we just cane the vandals like they do in Singapore? Okay, naive type situation given our culture environment. Those are not necessarily simple. And what we're doing there when we make suggestions like that and use naive simplicity to try to come to a conclusion, it's premature because we haven't talked about, or we just straight to the solution. All that's happening is we delay the chaos and fragmentation that occurs. Okay, so the naive simplicity does nothing more by coming up with solution suggestions like that, is to delay that. Overwhelming complexity is really scope restriction. In that case, what happens there is we constrain the problem that we're faced with. And if we do that, or we don't worry about that, or we will not consider that just yet because we can deal with that later. So they constrain the problem, and by doing that, you're really just delaying the chaos and the fragmentation. So it's scope restriction that we're talking about, simplifying to make it manageable, that we can manage, instead of dealing with the full wickedness of the problem, as that's suggested. Ways of taming this wicked problem by reducing the complexity is assert that the problem is solved. Specify parameters which are, and we can use to measure the OS. If we get that, we're fine. Cast the problem in. It's just like previously what we did, so let's do it the same thing, even though the situation is quite different, or slightly different for that matter. Give up trying to find a solution to the problem. Declare that there are just a few options, not look at the whole exhaustive list of potential options. And one of the techniques that we have, we'll be using, is to look at all the possible solutions. Okay, and then focus on the things that matter or could result. So, in fact, by taming the problem, and it's normally a no-no, just dealing with parts of the problem, oh yes, we'll deal with that. And in fact, we should be looking at the whole situation and looking at all the interrelationships that are possibly there. And that's a wicked, typical characteristic of a wicked problem. There's so many interrelated things that we can't easily forget about things and constrain that. One of the suggestions that's made in the readings that I gave you, the issue mapping, is what they call principal simplicity. And basically it's looking for shared understanding that we want. So it's common understanding from it. And so there's enough understanding that individuals can say, okay, I can see the way it comes, yep, I'll be committed to that. Okay? So even though philosophically I might have a little bit of a difference, but I can see where we're going possibly. So that the discourse that's happening, the dialogue that's occurring, will give us that particular confidence that's saying that because a wicked problem, there's no, we've got the ideal situation or the solution. All that we're saying, if we do that, we're better off than where we were. And that's all that we can say when we deal with it. And we're introducing it in this program, which the university likes, because that's where you are, most of you are at. You know, senior levels, managers, leaders. These are the sorts of problems that you most likely face, rather than try to solve a linear programming problem or a fact analysis problem. So it's necessary, and it doesn't necessarily agree with what they spoke about. And it relates to a point that Snowden was making, and that is emergent. The solution is emergent in the discussion. Oh, we didn't think of that, let's move that way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be what they originally thought the solution might be. Okay, quick reminder, lecture one we mentioned the types of data you'll need will vary depending on the decision situation. So the whole series of different complexities. And what time did you say we had to stop? Sorry, what time did you say?
About 7:20.
Another 5 minutes, okay. So the different data needs that we need to refer to or talk about. The numeric data, quantitative data that we talk about, is descriptive, predictive modeling that we talk about. And here we're going to look at that shared understanding aspect. So it's the discourse that we're more interested in. How do we manage or massage the discourse to give us the insights that we need to cater for that wicked problem? Quantitative, if you recall, in stuff it's descriptive, it's numerical normally, and basically look to examine relationships. And for quantitative, it's to find meaning. What is meaning that we have in terms of the experiences and culture and so on. In your assignment, where in that particular area, you're dealing with variables. I think I told you you had, 8 variables or 10 or whatever, I can't remember. There was some dependent variable or response variable that you had to select, quantitative. You had independent variables that you had to decide on, or explanatory variables, and in addition to that, extraneous variables that you could include in your analysis as part of your dummy variables and so on in your model building. Okay, that's the focus of your assignment. And if you, as an example, this is something I did many years ago. We're looking at the adoption of certain software that, as part of the CIDQ, we developed some software for analysis. And my question was, what's the intake? What the adoption level of this particular stuff? So we did some interviews, qualitative interviews, and measures, read the literature, and in this example, there was more than that. think there was about 20 we came up with, but acceptance of the computer software, so there had to be acceptance. Acceptance doesn't necessarily mean adoption. I can accept the software, but I won't adopt it. But strength of the process, how good the process is, perceived needs, that software is doing this, but hey, I don't need that. We're fine with that. Oh, yes, I do need this. So that's something that we're affected. And the organization, the vendor. That was a big factor because was then realized how strong that tie was with universities. Because I developed it, so I used to go and market it as part of the deal for the unit. And what was happening was because we were from the university, there was a better chance that they adopted. They tended the information we had, the less confident about the commercialized vendors that were trying to push the product where we were more concerned with. So as an example, you'll have 10 or whatever, and basically you come up with a regression equation that says a constant is a function of AS, which was acceptance of software, the perceived value, and so on. So that would be your regression model that you would be submitting to me and submitting for your marks. So this is predicting likelihood of adoption of software. How do we get this? Based on your own experience, or mainly from the literature. You read up the literature, this is what this particular study said, this particular study said that, this particular study said, and you use that in terms of hypothesizing in this environment, this venue or country, these are the things we're hypothesizing impact on that. In your case, you're looking at satisfaction. Was it satisfaction? Performance. And what are the variables that impact on that? Okay, so fairly straightforward. And stuff. Now, in terms of the domains that we need to consider as in part of the analytics modeling that we have, in terms of the complexity and the tools and processes that's used, it tends to be referred to as the 4 domains. This is the BDA, big data analytics, it's referred to in dealing with that. The first lot is our descriptives. That's statistics, central tendencies, dispersion data, data query, data visualization. Remember we did all that in the first 2-3 weeks. That's the sort of thing for descriptive analytics, gaining insights. Predictive, that is forecasting what might happen. And here we did regression. We didn't do this time around logic. Is that the pizza people waiting outside? Cluster analysis and so on. For that category. Prescriptive, which is what we're going to do today and next week. That's your multi-attribute value theory, decision analysis, simulation, hypothesis testing is part of also this bit. And experimentation is what we will be doing, I think, in the last week or next week. We'll be doing that. And GMA is generalized morphological analysis, probing, fail-safe, those sorts of things, and how do we deal. So it's experimental and cognitive type stuff that we're working. So this tends to cover most of the areas that analytics tend to cover. We tended to focus on this, and that. Questions, comments, queries? I think I might end there, and I'll stop at this one. And what we're saying is to deal with this, which is part of today and next week's lecture, this area, we're going to talk about 7 different decision types. The first one is evaluating. I have to choose between strategy A, B, C, D. Which one do we choose? Okay, and we use what we call multi-criteria decision making, or sometimes referred to as decision. MA, multi-attribute, same thing. And it's saying rather than make a holistic decision, I'll go for that or that or that, I'll use the divide and conquer rule, come up with the criteria that's important to us, analyze them, and then reconstruct it to our choice. Those are decision making under uncertainty we're not dealing with. That's Bayesian statistics. Catherine suggesting that we might introduce it next trimester. We dropped it and bring it back again. Allocation of resources. You know, I want to cater for or do this 20 things, but I have enough money for only 6 of those. Which ones get the Guernsey? Negotiating. What do we take? What do we give up to get the best bet? Simulation is just a brute force method of sampling. Communicating is what we'll be focusing on and using Habermas's, the ideal speech situation types. How do we get the best from our communication, discourse that we're having? And orchestrating is something that I've got there. Very little work has been done so far, and basically all that we do there is when we're dealing with the chaotic situation. I think I use that term mainly because I had ing right through. I thought I better get something that's also ending with ing, because when I remember what Giuliani was saying, was basically that's what he was doing. He was orchestrating the thing. Go do that, something. So he was acting as a person who was orchestrating the event, the chaotic situation that they're faced with. And the question is, how do we deal with it? There's a Siki method of that's developed in Japan that has promise, but that's an area when you want to get started on your PhDs, that's an area there that you might be able to work in a chaotic zone. How do we deal with situations like that, where we have to probe and deal with that? Okay? When we come back from the break, we'll go on and deal with, we'll continue with it. Okay, yes?
Which are the 3 that
We're going to concentrate on evaluate, allocate, and communicate. As I said, a lot of the stats we did, inferential stats and descriptive stats, can cover a lot of the different dimensions in that continuum, the first half, if you wish. So things that we did was determine if the intervention is superior, which intervention is superior, so that we can decide which ones to implement. Remember, we did inferences of difference of 2 means. Yes, no? Okay. And then here, which strategy is most suitable for us to adopt? Here is the weighted average that we're going to use in a second. And here, I put the reference on your textbook because that's where the next part comes from. So what we're going to do now is the evaluate decision type, and we'll continue next week with the allocate. So 2 different decision scenarios. Evaluate choices and allocate. So we'll start with evaluate choices. Now, the best way to describe this particular approach is to give you an example. Okay, it's an actual example, a real world example. Many years ago, we've been now married almost 42, 45 years, something like that, 45 years. And about 4 years ago, was our anniversary, wedding anniversary, Hilda and myself. So I said, let's go to a special restaurant. And she said, oh, that's a great idea. I said, let's try something. Let's use decision analysis to decide which restaurant we go to. Okay. So she agreed. She said, okay, let's do it. So in terms of solving the problem and using decision analysis, this is what we did. So first of all, and this is a actual case, okay? I said, what are the things that's important to you, for the special occasion of ours? She said, well, the quality of the restaurant we go to, the ambience and all that special occasion, that has to be good. So that's fine. So that was a criteria. I don't like driving, and hence that was a criteria that we considered. And at that stage, being a university professor, we not pay very much. So the cost was a factor. We couldn't go to a too expensive a restaurant. So those are the criteria. In practice, when you work on these tools, you deal with what's important, what should be informing your decision. Typically, when I craft strategies for organizations, in terms of which strategy you internationalize or whatever, right? What we do is we surface about 12, 13, a typical 12 to 15 criteria, things that are important to the organization, the risk associated with it, the profitability, the amount of control that they have for the different strategies that they can adopt, okay? So this is the criteria. Normally in practice, it's about 12 to 15, 16 or so. So that's The next thing we had to do was to decide on each of the criteria what are their preference scores. We use an interval scale. Interval scale is one that we can only make sense of the interval, the difference between values. It's not a ratio scale that says it's an absolute. So when we talk about interval scale, I tend to like to use, when I'm dealing with business people, to use the word preference scale, which is the most preferred. We'll give it 100, 7, and the least preferred, we give it a 0. So we use a scale that references the, so it's not a ratio scale, because an interval scale which we use for these sorts of technique, there's no 0 origin. 0 doesn't mean 0. 0 means it's the least preferred. Whereas a ratio scale, 0 means 0. Zilch. I've got 0 inventory, Zilch inventory. I made 0 profit, so 0 profit, and so on. Okay, so in this case, preference scale are still now which restaurant in terms of quality, the 3 that we consider. There was a whole list, but we shortlisted it to 3. There was a French, I don't know whether you know the Loose Box. That's quite a distance from here, that has French cuisine and very nice restaurants. So that was one of hers. Italian restaurants, Northbridge, and also a Chinese restaurant in Northbridge. Okay, or closer than Northbridge. But so these were the, she said French restaurant was the most preferred, so we gave it a score of 100. The Chinese was the least preferred, 0, and the difference between the French and the Italian was about the same as the difference between Italian and the Chinese. Now here, Chinese 0 doesn't mean that Chinese didn't have any quality. The one that was shortlisted was fantastic in quality, but relative to the rest, it was the least preferred. That make sense? The distance, the Chinese restaurant was the closest, so that was the most preferred. The French restaurant was the furthest, so it was the least preferred, and the distance between the Italian and the Chinese was the same as the distance between the Italian and the French. And the average cost, French restaurant was the most expensive, Chinese was the cheapest. The Italian was relatively cheap, but not as cheap as the Chinese. And here, incidentally, when we, sorry?
So why didn't you do a 50 rather than a 90?
Because it's actually a ratio scale. What we use a 90 was because, let's say if the Chinese restaurant was, say, $200 for the meal. If the Italian restaurant in this case was, I think, 180, 175. Whereas the French restaurant was $350, $400. So if I, well, let me just go one step to answer your question more specifically. Let's say if I had, I think better if I use the distance and you see the relationship. It's easier to explain with distance. If I told you that the Chinese was 4 kilometers away, the French restaurant was 8 kilometers away, and the Italian was 6 kilometers away. Now that's a ratio scale, right? 0 means the restaurant is next door to our house, and so on. Now, because for this sort of technique we use an interval scale, or preference scale, the closest to me, because I don't like driving, is 4 kilometers, so I'll give it 100. The least preferred, the furthest away, I give it a 0. And the Italian, is it? Italian was 6. That works out to 50.
So it's calculated literally.
That's right. So you convert a ratio scale to an interval scale. So the price, it could be 200, 280, and $500. Okay. So it's not 50 in that case. The difference. So we convert the interval scale, I mean the ratio scale, to an interval scale. Most programs that I'll show you, the one that we use, does that automatically. In the exam, you might have to calculate it yourself, convert one scale to the other, and we'll show you how to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Good. Let's go on. So we've got preference scores for each of those values. Then the next thing is, even though they're all important to us, in some cases some are more important than others. So somewhere in the analysis that you do for weighted average, you need the weights, relatively important. So in this case, still I said which is the most, or the quality is the most important. So I benchmarked it at 8. Let me just go one step back. In terms of this, when I work with groups, I find that basically we have a scale 100, and when we have many options, normally there's 7, 8, 9 options that we're dealing with, I try to get them to locate the one that is most preferred, and they don't have really problems with that. That's the best one. So we give it 100, let's say. Okay. Then I say, which is the least preferred? This one is least preferred. They don't have any difficulty with that normally. If we do, we let's say B. Then C is the next one. So I say we have now that and that. Now with C restaurant, for argument's sake, is it closer to 100 or is it closer to 0? It's closer to 0. It's on the second one. No. Is it closer to the 50 mark or is it closer to the 0? It's pretty well closer to the 0. So what you do is you ask them those sorts of questions and they guide you in the end you put the value C is there, and so on. Okay, so you're asking them questions like that, they find that they can, so I always peg it to the best and the worst. These ones are the more difficult ones for them to do, so that's how is it closer to this or closer to that? And then we do later on, as you see, sensitivity analysis. You gave 20. What will the solution be like? Will the solution space change if you increase it to 30 or 50? And we do sensitivity analysis on that. But at this stage, we've got that particular value, and we do in the same way, we go for the reference code. Really, we need weights that should add up to 1, but it's hard to ask, what's the weight? 0.25, they can't do that, so we peg of that which is the best. So in this case, he'll just say, this is the best. Then I said, the distance, I said, even though I don't like driving, that's a little bit around the 20 mark. The average cost is about halfway, even though we're not paid a lot. The special occasion I saved over the last 5 years so that we can afford a meal or whatever. Okay. So we gave it a score, but we come up with those sorts of things. And you see, I worked, in an example, we worked with a doctor's surgery that they had partners and they had to decide on certain aspects of that. Not a big decision, right up to the brows stuff where I used this to make a $16 billion decision that they had to make. So this simple type technique can apply to stuff, and as you see, the sensitivity analysis that's done will give them the confidence in terms of the choice. So having got that, what we then said is, let's convert that to weights, because they can do that. Then we say, well, this one, really the weight is 100 over 170 gives us 0.8. 20 over 170 gives us 118. 50 over 170 gives us 0.294. That has to add up to 1. So now, to find out the multi-attribute value score, MAVT, what we do is we multiply the preference score by the weight, and that's on page 72 that I highlighted earlier in the textbook that shows you how to calculate the weighted average. Okay, so we come up with a composite score that's a weighted average score. So in this case, we're saying for the French restaurant, okay, they scored 100 there for quality, and that had a weight of this. The distance, French scored a 0, which has a weight of that, and for average cost, it has 0 with a weight of that. Multiply out and add as your page 73 tells you, it comes up with a multi-attribute value score of 58.8. And I was taking all the things in terms of the preference and the weights. We do the same for the Italian, 50 times the weight, 50 times the weight, and 90 times the weight, giving us a grand total of 61.78. And for C, this is automatically done for you, same thing, the value, preference score times the weight, gives us a value of 41.2. So, Adrian, where did Hilda and I go to? Which restaurant did we go to? Sorry? Italian, no. We went to the one Hilda wanted to go to. No, I'm kidding. You're right in the sense that in multi-attribute value scores, you would tend to choose the one that has the largest, multi-attribute value score. Okay? Questions or comments? So it's a fairly straightforward method, but it can be applied to quite a number of different possibilities.
So just the reality, even if you're making a big decision, the 61 and 58, right, it's not that big, right?
You're
make
right.
a $16 billion decision.
Yep.
You're
And
gonna-
we're going to do sensitivity analysis now to see, what if that changed. In fact, this one, it did have this, we did, in terms of, we had more criteria and we discussed it, and that shared understanding was what I was after. But basically, in cases like this, what I would do here is, in fact, we did go to the French restaurant. And the reason for that is because the difference from that is very small. And the loose box, I don't know whether you've been there, has accommodation. And they had a special on accommodation if you went there. So because the difference was small, rather than solve it again, which we could, we said, no, we'll go to that particular restaurant. Okay. If the difference between that and that, I think as you implied was, that was 50 and this was 85, then I would go for the Italian. So you have to do sensitive, what's the difference, what are the implications. All that this is doing for best decisions and all the models that I'll be talking about, not like statistics, is basically reflecting back the situation. So what you do, and I'll show you in 1 second, you're saying if we take all these things that are important to us, that's the best solution. If you change the weight from whatever we use to something else, that's the implication. So you're reflecting back to the decision makers as to the implication of the choices that they make, the sensitivity of the choices that they use. And that tells you exactly what the situation is. That's what I'm going to show you now, a program called HighView. HighView stands for hierarchical view. And there are 16, 15, 20, and I have one that we use for ourselves, that we develop specifically for ourselves, but the idea behind it, and they range from $200 off the shelf to the most expensive one. This one I think is £700, which is just 1,000 something. So they're not expensive and they can be bought off the shelf quite easily. My first models I used 25 years ago was written in Excel. I wrote it in Excel to do that, and we applied it to. So now it's easier and it's cheap enough to use that. So the program that I want to deal with, I think if I escape, and if I do that, does it come up? Yeah. So basically in this situation, let's assume that I want to make a decision with regard to the best strategy I should adopt. And in this case, let's say the options that I have, the options are, I can continue. So in the analysis and where I'm taking it from, it's, or the stage I'm using or taking it from, is within a situation audit, SWOT analysis, gap analysis, and also to find the springboard if you've done your strategy unit, the springboard that you do. This is the current situation, and now you've got a desired future. I use these terms because whenever I facilitate a group on strategic planning, everyone is an expert on strategic planning. Or what do you call it? A future statement or a vision statement should include that. A mission statement should include this and that. Doesn't really matter. What is it you're trying to do? Where are you trying to aim towards? Let's get that, and the terminology is that. And then we look at different ways of getting there. This is covered very well in the literature, textbooks. Strategy, that's covered very well. Vision, mission, and all that, the desired future. And then you have the different strategies to get you from your resource base to the future. And this is where most of the literature doesn't do well in terms of which one do you choose, which one's the best for you, for your organization as a whole. Okay, so we're here, we have to identify, first of all, what are the things, or what are the different ways of getting from here to there. And in this case, the ones that they've identified in the analysis and discussion, and we'll talk about participation and that sort of thing later on. Status quo, continue the way we have with the products and all that we have. Now we've been making a reasonable profit, and we'll ultimately get to where we want to go if we do that. So that's an option. Or we can do R&D, the organization, continue with the current strategy, but we'll place more emphasis on and resources into research and development for new product, go for a joint venture with an electronics company, internationalize, go into Southeast Asia over the next year, 2 years, and then diversify, related diversification. So these are different options that they have, strategic options. The cases that I do in practice normally, as I said, range between 8, 9, 7 different options that they can consider. So which one do we choose? So the question then is, what are the things that are important to you as a decision-making group or this organization? What are the things that are important to you? And what they do then is to say, well, the cost of implementation might be the cost to implement a strategy, the risk associated with that strategy. Some are more risky than others, and that was important to them. How quickly, because the competitors were starting to come in, market growth, short-term, long-term profitability, the control that they have and the flexibility, because one of the options was to go into a joint venture, and if they did, then the amount of control they'll lose to their partner. Does that make sense? So these are the sorts of... Now, in most cases, organizations can come up quite easily with the things that are important to them. They can rattle. Sometimes they don't, or they find it very difficult. I think the group that found it most difficult was a group called the Independent Living Group, and the board, I was dealing with the board, and most of them were very elderly individuals. And when we asked them things like this, they found it very, very difficult to articulate, even though they know what is important to them. And there's lots of tricks that we use, and I'll just mention a couple that if you start using it, you might want to consider. I normally say, just, you've got 6 options or 5 options or 4 options, just rank them. Which one you think is the most valuable, the one that you want or important to you, in second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. So they'll say, oh, A is first, followed by C, followed by D, followed by B, and so on. Okay? Can you see that? They just listed up. Then I go around the room and said, okay, and then I go to the next person and they said, oh, A, D, B, and C. C was the best. D, B, and A, and so on. So each one will give theirs. And what I do is I just go through that. I said, no, why did you say A was the best, and here you saying A was the least preferred option in terms of your ranking? Oh, the reason why I said that is because this one is the least risky of all. Risk is something that's important to you. This one said, oh, the cost. Or A was tremendous. Cost is an important factor too. So what you do in that discussion with them highlighting, they surfacing things that are important to them in their thinking. So there are different tricks that we can use to actually start getting it. Most organizations can rattle it off, what is important to them. But if they can't, we've got tricks like this. Oh, you're saying that C is the best there, and you're saying C is the worst there. What? Oh, and they give you that reasons, and in so doing, you're surfacing the criteria that is important to them, because this are the things that should be used to inform the decision they make, the choice they make. Once they're doing it, you don't have to, because you can use the model without doing it. I tend to, and you see the advantage of it, group it according to cost and benefit. Okay. The independent living group, the oldies, as I say, they were riddle rattle when you ask cost benefit. So terms that I use, I remember saying, no, which one will cause you most pain? Which one will give you most gain? You know, these are the terms that they, for me, the things that I want less of, more, or less of, the ones that cause the pain, the cost and the risk. And so you can quite easily group those two. You don't have to, but it has an advantage of doing that. So here, things that we want less of, all the criteria, things that we want more. So once we've structured it, we then, as we did in the exercise example that we had, we then relate the benefits and the cost. I'll just go through the... You're lucky this year it isn't, but if you have friends in next year doing the course, don't tell them, but next year I'll be introducing the actual software where they have to actually, I'll be examining them on the results that they get. But this one I'll tell you, but you won't be examined. You'll be examined on the calculation, but not the program. So, the risk, let's say the amount of control. To anyone. The amount of control, it says, at the amount, the status quo is the most preferred. You know, you're all there by yourself. No one's going to what do you call, counter you. The least preferred is the joint venture 0. R&D is similar to what I'm doing myself, so that's fairly high, and so we come up with these numbers. And as they're talking, 5 is what? Diversity is, 5 is 70, yeah, diversity is 70. As they're talking, it should be higher or lower, and you're actually working with them to come up with a particular value, and they love that because they think that's 70. Yeah. Let's put it so that. So you're getting from them a good feel in terms of the preference scores. Now, if someone says, I think that should be 80, and someone else says, no, I think it should be 70 or 30. Now, if there's a disagreement there, what I do as a facilitator, I say, okay, we'll start working with either 30 or 70. Let's say let's use 70. But we'll also do some sensitivity analysis and see what happens to our solution if we reduce it from 70 to 30. Does that make sense? So they're comfortable that we can vary. So that's what we'll do. So I take note of those values that is the disagreement. In fact, I always encourage that disagreement. I think I mentioned to you. Sorry, multiple disagreements, yeah. So it's ranged between 30 or 40, 30 or that. So let's first of all look at that extreme. If the extreme doesn't have an effect, then it's
what if there's a disagreement on time or hand on?
So the same thing is time. I think it's going to take 3 weeks, and someone says I think it's going to take 2 weeks.
And also a disagreement on, sorry.
Yeah, we can have many, as you see. You can have disagreements in everything that you want. You can still model it. And I tend to encourage that disagreement, because what happens sometimes when you get a group of people there and someone says, I think it's 80. Oh, yeah, okay, 80. Everyone's agree 80. Then you've got a group of non-thinkers. Terrible to work with that group. They just agree, because they don't understand or they don't. And that was a problem initially. And now what we do is if a new group is going to use this, I have a session with them a week before, and I explain what the model is and how it works and that sort of thing, so that they get, because if not, you get a group of non-thinkers saying, oh yeah, 90, that's fine. They're tired, they don't want to argue. But you want that. I think it's 60. Why? Because see, I didn't think of it that way. Yeah, maybe. You see, that's a shared understanding that you're working towards. Okay, now you do the same for all of them. So you have the list of criteria, costs. Some are what we call inverse. So for instance, risk. The higher the risk, the lower the preferred. So the models do these sorts of adjustments and all that. But basically, you're coming up with a preference score. Okay, now once you've got that, you can then give weights. Say for the benefit, the weight for benefits is 100 for profitability, 90 for and 60, as we did for the hotel example or the restaurant example. Everyone understand? So we can get weights. Now once we've done that, what happens then is we work towards the final stuff and we get the strategy. And I'm saying of what I'm going to do, taking all the preference scores there and their weights, the highest multi-attribute value score is the R&D strategy, which is 72, and the second highest is the status quo, 63. Okay, so that takes all the things that are important to us and so on. But we never use, and this is important, we never use the answer in a solution sense. These sorts of models are used in what we call a shared understanding sense. You're reflecting it back to that. So what we want is not, that's the solution, therefore we go for it. It's only the term that Larry Phillips from the School of Economics in London School of Economics refers to it as conditionally prescriptive stuff. We're saying, yeah, if you follow all the axioms and your preference scores, then that's the best. But there are other factors, like I said, there was some hidden stuff. There was accommodation in there. So there are other things that come into place. No model can take everything into consideration, so that argument or the discussion is important. So the questions that I ask is, what is the model telling us? Let's have a look. It's saying that, in fact, if we look at the scores, the highest one we said was R&D with 72. Most of the benefits are high. So the red is benefits, the cost is green. In this one here, we're saying, let's assume if this one was the highest, I would say, the cost advantage or the benefit advantage there is fairly low compared to the others. But there's a cost advantage. Can you see? I can start making assessment because if I look in the next case, just going a bit, if I then break it up into individual bits, risk and so on, I can say, well, let's assume that we have and this was the highest value. And I say, well, you know, in this instance, that particular option is only contributing to 4 of the things that were important to me. Does that make sense? So maybe we should reconsider that and go for something else that maybe is not so high but has advantage or some element of all the criteria that we saw advantage. So it's not giving them a solution, but it's reflecting back to them the implications and the values of the different things. That's what we call shared understanding. So each one has your own internal representation of the situation. So I look at it from my partial reality and beliefs and values. You look at it that way. And the discussion that I mirror back each time is to try to get that overlap. And that overlap is that shared understanding that we talk about. Remember when we said that best thing is to do is to work towards that shared understanding? So that's one thing. And someone would say, hey, you know, what is the model really telling us? Let's have a look. If I do a map, I say cost and benefit. This is my efficient frontier. And it's all just based on the few values that we get, and your chapter covers that. That's my efficient frontier. I forget about option 3. Don't worry about it at this stage. Because I can always find another option. Let's take option 2 for argument's sake, that has more benefits than 3 and is more preferred in terms of cost, because this is a preference scale, don't forget, more preferred of cost. So in a sense, this is what we call the dominated solution. We only focus on the efficient solutions. Can you see how that's dominated, and we won't worry about it? I'm going to have a great time next year in the exam questions, giving all these graphs and charts for them to interpret. That's what we're aiming for. Does that make sense? And someone says, you know, what if you said, when we worked earlier, you said that the weightings that we're going to use there, or we decided that we're going to focus a little bit more on the benefits and slightly less on the cost, of 60-40% ratio. What if we gave 50-50, gave equal weights to benefit and cost? What are the implications? Well, let's have a look. So I do an analysis. Sensitivity. Oh, no. Let's see. For benefit, we had 60, so we said benefits. We had a weight of 60. And the best option, if you recall, was R&D. If you change the weight to 50, that's not going to affect the solution. In fact, the weight that we can give can vary anywhere between about 45 right up to 87, and it's not going to change the solution space. So don't lose any sleep over it. You know, if it's, oh, should we have 80 or 70 or 60? This very quickly, and in fact, in a lot of analysis that I've done, you find that the shaded area tends to be close to that optimum line in about 5% of the cases only. And once you've identified that, then you go back and talk a little bit more and discuss to get there. Should it be that or should it be something else? Does that make sense? So it's not for just the solution that we're after, but the discussion and that shared understanding. Someone might then say, what else? There's a qualitative we can do. This model allows us to, and I won't do it here because I haven't set it up for it. It allows us to use words rather than numbers. Some people just freak out with numbers, you know, 50, 60, and 70. And so what we do is we have words like very weak agreement, medium agreement, half agreement, very strong agreement. So we use words like that to represent values on the scale. So they say, yeah, we have full agreement with that, or that's a high risk, or that's a low risk, and we use words like that. I tend to stay away from it because what happens in the model is we map the words against a number at the back. You know, high is 100, not so high is 75, and so we map. And it's terrible from a decision-making point when they use the word. They don't know what number is actually being used for the calculation. Some people find it's essential because people just freak out when they have to use numbers. I don't like it because it's blind. They're just saying those words, but they don't know what really are the numbers behind it. Okay, so that's the, what else can we do? So we can do all sorts of things. So this is referred to sensitivity analysis, where we can change values. Let's try 70. Is the solution space that we have in the fission fungi going to change because of that change? Oh no, then don't lose any sleep over it. Most MAVT models are fairly robust. So in fact, once you build a model, the change in your solution space tends to be fairly rigid in a sense, or robust, I think is a better word than rigid, so that you can make changes, and in this case 5% tend to be affected. So it's a fairly robust model and tends to be that. Another reason why it's, I'm just seeing if I missed out anything, you can have functions that you can use. So you can say it's a non-linear function. As my values go up, preference, then the actual preference score changes. So it's not a linear scale that I'm suggesting there, but a non-linear scale. So you can do all sorts of these fancy things if you wish. But basically you come up to a stage where you then have the values that determine the possible thing, but it's only conditionally prescriptive in the sense that just because it's 70, that's what you're going to do. There could be other factors because no model can take everything into consideration. And in considering, you might say because these are so close, I might use this instead of that. Yes?
This approach, whereabouts in the industry would you actually use this?
Sorry?
Where in industry would you actually use this?
What industry?
Yeah.
We used it for mining companies.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah. The Woodside for their, what do you call it, Browse, $16 billion project. The first one. And the reason why we did the first one, pulled out, the best option that we came up with was not the floating, what do you call it? Yeah, well, the most expensive was because the criteria that they were using were a lot to do with an environmental impact. And that had the least environmental impact, even though the cost was high. Now, the reason why, even though that showed up high, we decided against it or recommended against it, because at that stage, one of the difficulties was the floating LNG plant, the coupling was not developed well. Now, since then, that's right. Now, you notice the discussion now is they've solved that problem. So now it becomes a viable option because the problem with the coupling was now.
And that's why I went onshore.
Yep. Okay, so there was, oh no, I thought they're going to go offshore because.
No, but the original one.
Oh, the original one, because of the environment. And I must admit, the Browse, the Browse idea made me change my view about mining companies. I always thought mining companies just raped the environment and did a lot of damage. And when I started working, I was pleasantly surprised. This is the, incidentally, before that's the floating LNG option that we had. We had the Browse to Kimberley hub option. We had the offshore LNG development option. We had the Browse to Burrup option and Browse to Darwin. So these were just the options that we used, and they had, I think, 33 criteria. And sorry, just before that, and the thing that surprised me most, as decision theorists, you're pretty poor in terms of money for resources for criteria. And there we had to do a study on the marine, 300,000 no to it. And so we got the data, actual data to assess. And the thing that I thought, no, mining companies are not too bad, because where they had, the Aboriginal hand painting, one of the options would disrupt that, and they spent a great amount of stuff to divert the option to. So to me, that really they had a heart in terms of what they were doing, not just raping the stuff, which I tended to believe before. So it's a change. Sorry, you were making a point.
I recognise this kind of process because we've got a process where, as a development engineer, you go a framing workshop, you invite everyone there, everyone puts their ideas into a box or whatever, so no one ever knows or gets influenced by everyone else's idea. And then it creates all the concepts. And then we say all the issues, decision-making issues with each concept. And then we put like a figure, but I was just wondering, this quantitative way, we didn't
measure.
On lower complexity projects, we would do it just as a desktop-based.
Yeah, it's just fine in some cases.
I was thinking, a greenfield project like Browse is billions of dollars. they
Yeah.
must have a quantitative way.
16 billion.
Yeah.
There was the
So
amount.
this
That
is the kind of way they do it. Yeah.
yeah. There was myself from Curtin. There was a professor from Oxford University, and there was another lady, a doctor in environmental science, and the three of us were the advisors to the browse stuff as to what.
When did this happen?
Sorry, about 3-4 years ago, 4 years ago,
First
and they've changed their decision. And
No, it's the first project we got canned, and then now the new revised version
Yeah.
is 2 FPSOs with a long pipeline
Yep.
all the way to
Yeah.
KPP.
Yep.
For Arthur.
Yeah.
The reason why they could do that is because they were waiting for Inpex to do their 800-kilometre pipeline.
Pipeline, yeah.
To see if it could actually be done. That was the longest pipeline in the world. Now it's going to be 920.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty with it, but again, a lot of uncertainty about the technology that was being used and all that. But they had to work at the first stage in terms of that.
And that's the one that they've chosen now to go through and find out in December.
7, yeah, that's right. And I think the other complication was they were partnered with China and that sort of, and that causes another dimension of what do you call it, uncertainty and stuff.
Always struggle. We have these projects and about 70% of them get canned. But it really is just because there's so many conflicting points like cost, technical complexity, whatever, the risk. And usually it's the biggest voice in the room
Yeah.
that decides
That's right.
whether it goes ahead or not. It wasn't really because of any
Yeah.
quantitative.
Well, the quantity now is coming in, and that's a good point when you mentioned like risk. For instance, at that stage, we introduced the whole concept. It's not new, and that whole risk, the impact, and the likelihood of occurrence, and we had, the different shades of color where the high impact. So those sorts of analysis were being quantified more so than before, where it was, oh yes, it's high risk or high likelihood, but actually putting measures 1 to 9 in terms of that particular stuff. Now, to just add on to what the question you asked, the other areas that I do quite a bit of work in, these sorts of things are local government. I've got about 15 local governments we work on this, and resource allocation. They tend to use resource allocation more than this because normally they have 60 million stuff, and they have $80 million worth of projects. They don't have which one. So that's the sort of thing. So it's applied, and I think it's the thing that I like about it. It's not quantitative in the sense that it is measured. It's conditionally prescriptive. Let's put some preference scores, and preference scores are not as good as ratio scales. If you have, that's great. But if you don't, that gives you an idea and that shared understanding. The thing that you implied, that maybe I read you a little bit wrongly, in terms of using these particular techniques where you actually get people to submit their options and then they vote for a preference score and that sort of thing. That's fine, but there are dangers in that. First of all, what you want is not people in the background just putting their submission. Where the strength is that shared understanding among all the clients. Where I did some work, and that's important for all those involved, stakeholders be involved in that, because little job, not a big job, I did many years ago for the Swan taxi, where we had the 12 executives there, CEO and planned this 2-day session where we were going to make a decision that they had to. And halfway through the process, the CEO had a call. We were working at Curtin, had a call, and he had an emergency situation. And so he said, okay, you'll carry on and I'll go. And what I did, I said, no, stop the meeting. It was a bit of annoyance because a lot of them took days off and that sort of thing, and the schedules and all that. I said, no, I won't. Because if you don't have the stakeholders there, these sorts of processes, you go after working 2 days or 3 days on it or whatever, and then you make the recommendation to the CEO. Because he was not privy to the discussion that was there, he says, no, that's not the option that I want. See, so that's a danger. The other thing is the average, and I think because we've done stats in the first 8 weeks, I stay away from averaging. It's a quick way, easy way, but it's misleading because an average always gives you the central measure. What you want is the divergence, and hence why you say that and why you say that, what's the difference? That's where that shared understanding comes. If you average, you can very quickly get the preference score, but you really haven't satisfied any of the groups. You don't get the buy-in.
We do this, but it's kind of like a 6x6 matrix.
Mhm.
We don't say
That's
it
fine.
gets an E3 or whatever.
Yeah, that's great that you use something like this. That's formal.
As stakeholders have to agree with that.
Yeah.
Is some of the safety to
Yep. Exactly. That to me, that's great. Yeah.
but
It's a step forward.
quite qualitative. Like, I mean, it's kind of based on experience. So some people would say,
Based on your experience, that you have to justify. That's it. Why? Why do you say that? Or why are you saying it should be higher than what I'm suggesting? There's a concept that we use when I'm facilitating a group. It's the force of the better argument. So if I say, I think, as an example, I think it should be on a scale of 1 to 10. I think it should be 1. And the boss says, no, I think it should be 7. Now, the force of the better argument that we explained to them before is the boss can say, no, I want it to be 7. The question that I ask is, why is 7 better than 1? And unless you can justify that, and and if you can justify, the others are listening, and so there's a lot of subtleties that go on in the facilitation process. I think is important, but the fact that you're using some sort of systematic way, I think is great, because one of the things that I know I do, or my aim, my philosophy in consulting that I do, is anything that I introduce to the organization, I don't want to have to go back, not more than twice, because tools like this are easy enough to leave it with the organization and you run it. I don't want to have them depend on me the whole time. Now, once you know the tools, so you improve it, and that's what you want, to leave it with them for them to actually use it. And if I have to go more than 3 times to consult over the same sorts of things, I think I haven't done my job. But it's good to hear anyone else use similar sorts of tools, because that, to me, is fantastic that you're doing. Any uses of it? The next anniversary, you should ask your spouse to apply these sorts of tools. So again, you can do these sorts of, it gives you an idea, it's a shared understanding. So reflecting back, if you do that, that's the implication. If you do that, that's the implication. And what you try to do as decision theorists is, and this is what we did with the brow, is in this case, for instance, the cost and the benefit. If you have, this is only 4 or 5 options. Normally you have clusters here. What is it within that and this that I can maybe combine and come up with a new or better option that I have to deal with? So it doesn't tell you the answer, but it's systematic. Oh, this is this. And in this case, when they looked at this, and this is contrived from an actual example that I worked with, an organization. I didn't see it, but they saw it, and they said, oh, we started off wanting to do a strategy or employ a strategy, but looking at this, why don't we use it as a temporal approach? And I did tell them that. They said, why don't we start with the status quo, clean up the shop? We did a SWOT analysis, we found out what our limitations, improve that, and work towards a research and development strategy. And so that will take more time, more costly, but give us some benefit. Once you got that, we'll then ultimately move to an internationalization program. So you can use it in different ways. If you have a cluster, how can we group? And that's the discussion that you have with the group. And voting externally and all that, to me, you compromise. You don't get the benefit of that insights that you're reflecting back to them each time when you use this particular. And that's the strength. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Sure.
I didn't see any of the readings in the textbook understanding what those graphs are telling us.
You don't, because this is a particular software. Yeah. One book that I can refer to you, that's I'll send it through.
The comment you made about us being tested on what they mean, is that your...
Oh, no, not this year. It's
that's next year. Next year.
So if you decide you don't want to do well in the test and then repeat it next year, you'll be up for that. But this year...
Just need to be clear.
Yeah, no, I won't ask. Because unless you play around, and I'll give them access to, unless you play around, you really don't get a feel as to what it...
Sorry, the second part coming from the fact that only one person in this class is using it in their industry.
Yep.
Is that because A, it's an expensive program, B, it's just not known, or because I work with a fellow over one nation, I'm sure that they...
There's not many. Normally I get much more, because a lot of the students of groups like this are local government. Local government is using it a hell of a lot. The organizations that are using it, but they don't see it as this, are the ones that have spreadsheets that they find.
Transparency though,
Transparency. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. My ambition many years ago, because I was trained in, I don't know whether you've heard of group support systems, where you use the technology, you do brainstorming and it coordinates, and my vision was to have that, because I've been to some boardroom and they had fantastic boardroom, and I said all we need to do is to put some smarts and get them to work in groups and make decisions like this and all that. But it never took. And the reason for that is a lot of them are saying, yeah, we can afford it and all that, but what we normally want is an external person, because if it's an internal, they feel they can push certain agendas, and that was one of the reasons why it never took off, that group support system. But the applications that I said here, why isn't it taken up? But maybe it comes under a different name or different title. I do a lot of work. I've got a client base of about 60 organizations that have used various levels of this sort of analysis, and the ones that use it find it easy enough for them after a couple of sessions running off with it themselves. So that's, might be wrong, but that's how I read the situation.
Does the health industry use it?
I don't know of anyone in the health, but he's in China at the moment. He's in China at the moment. I did a course for AIM about 3 weeks ago, and he was in attendance. He's a doctor and has 4 wizard pharmacies, and he said, I can apply this in my. So I'm seeing him when he comes back in 3 weeks' time to actually start applying. So that's my only exposure to medical.
Yeah, but I think there's lots of kind of budgetary decisions and resource allocation, but it often...
Resource allocation we're going to do next week, and you'll be amazed with resource allocation. It's much more powerful than this, but this is choice. So whenever we have to evaluate, make choices, this is our tool. And it's always, how can I'm not trying to push it or promote it, but for many years at Curtin University, my colleagues used to tell me, hell, you get most things you ask for, you get. What is it? You're just lucky that the head of school or the staff like you. And what they don't know was, before any meetings or before any request, I do a little one like this. So if the school says, oh no, we can't do that. Oh yes, we can because of this. And so you have all the trade-offs that I've already thought through. So by just saying that, any thinking person will find it hard to not give you what you want. Yeah, so so it's a trick that I don't tell anyone, but that's that's a trick I use just so that I understand the trade-offs myself. If I do more of this, is what if, that's the sort of thing. And as you know, when you make decisions, if you counter it with something that's reasonable, no reasonable thinking person can say no.
But I think also the other key message from what you said is you have to have the right stakeholders involved.
That's right.
Maybe that's the problem with a lot of decisions that are made in industry,
Yep.
is that if you don't have the right stakeholders present for the entire decision-making process, you won't make the right decision.
And in terms of just adding on to that, in terms of the decision making, one of the things that I'll mention, don't go into any depth later on, the last lecture, is that whole is the composition of the team. I've got a process, or we developed a process when I was director of that. It's called the GDAM, or Generalized Decision Assurance Methodology. And part of that is that the mix or the makeup of the group has to be enough to get the different realities, multiple realities, and the intelligences that are required are informed intelligence, communicative intelligence, and all that you have in the group. And my question, and I don't know what the answer is, because I retired before I embarked on that particular, and my question was, in a group, do you need all those intelligences? Everyone in the group has to have that level of intelligence, or the group as a whole has that intelligence? I've got an inkling as to what the right answer is, but I've got no empirical information. I think it should be as long as the whole group, because it's almost impossible to have an individual having those 6 different intelligences. Normally you're good at that and not good at that. So that's but I've got no empirical data to prove it at this stage.
What I found also was not only the right people in the room, but there's also some people you wouldn't invite. Like, I deliberately did not not avoided certain people.
Yeah.
And you're not
Why?
avoiding a
Why?
substitute, because